Hello everyone, and welcome to the sixth video in this series of using PowerApps for business processes. In today's video we'll look at the actual flow submission and what happens when the user selects an option and then clicks on submit. If you haven't watched the previous videos, it might be a good idea to do so, just to give you some background as to what it is that we're busy with. Right, so there are two ways of triggering flow. The one is by having flow listen to your workflow history list or table, and as soon as a new row or item is added, then trigger. That works very well and it's very fast. The only problem with that is that if you're using SQL on premises, the trigger doesn't work as soon as a new item is added. So at the time of doing this video, that doesn't work yet, so I'm sure that the flow team will get to it. But right now, if you use that, you'll have to use the second option, where if you're using an on-premises SQL server to store your workflow history, you'll have to patch the workflow history table with your new record, and then you'll set the value of a variable to contain the row ID for that item that you've added. And that'll actually then be used to call flow and give it that ID, so the flow knows which workflow history or instruction to action. So it works very well. Only problem is there's a slight delay or an extra delay for the user after clicking submit, because PowerApps is then responsible for initiating the flow run. So jumping into flow, we're going to create a new one from scratch. So we hope nothing breaks, everything goes well. So like we discussed, we're using SharePoint Online, so we can easily use the trigger as soon as a new item is added. So we simply go and select SharePoint, and to tell it when an item is created, this flow should trigger. Right, we now need to give it the name of our SharePoint site. Let's give it a custom value, and now select our workflow history list, which we're now also using as an instruction for flow to trigger. Right, first action we're going to create is a variable, and this variable we just need to initialize over here, because we're going to use it in a switch statement later. We don't want to initialize it on every step case, on every switch case. So we're going to initialize a variable. Let's call this var next step, and it's going to be a string. Let's call it step 1. Okay, and then also all your actions, make sure that you rename it to something that makes sense, otherwise it can become quite messy. Alright, so initiate var next step, and looks like we're off to the races. As soon as you have one action, just save the flow. Just save the flow and make sure that it's there, otherwise you spend hours on something and browser crashes and then your flow is gone. So next we want to tell flow what it is that we're working with, and both from a data perspective as well as our JSON business profile or business process profile. We want to tell flow where to find these things, and to do that we're going to create a new action. We're going to use SharePoint and tell it to get an item. Again, we're going to point it to our SharePoint site. Let's go and copy that and choose our data list this time, which is just staff onboarding flow, and then pass it the ID to tell it which record to return. Now at this stage it might be seeing it as a different data type, but at this stage it's not picking up that the record ID column from when an item is created is actually an integer that could be inserted here. Alright, so that means it would have listed it here if it worked correctly, but what we can do to get around that is to just tell it to write a small formula, or an expression rather, and we're going to be using trigger body. So that knows that this trigger, when at runtime, the trigger will have a body of data that it returns, and inside of that body we can now just tell it to go and look for the record ID in the array. Alright, so it should be happy with that. Yes, it is. So that's good. Next thing we want to do is to tell or connect it to the flow run to our JSON business process profile. To do that, let's go and click at the top and say add a parallel branch. So the only reason why we do that is, to reduce the flow runtime. To get data might take, a little bit of time. So if you do these things in parallel, all of the long-standing or long-running actions running at the same time. So especially if you're using SQL on premises, this makes quite a big difference. Alright, so let's go and select our custom connector that we created, and there it is, flow BPM profile, and the action we're going to be using is fetch flow BPM profile. You'll see that it's now asking us for the process key, and all of that information it's getting from Swag, or the custom connector that we use to create the connection. So in there we need to pass it the process key, and we have the process key already in the workflow history table. So if we go into, you'll see we're going to look under the trigger when an item is created, and then it shows you all of the properties that it returns in the body for that trigger, and we're going to be using process key. Alright, so if you structure this correctly, like we said earlier, you can also use the same flow run for multiple business processes, so you don't have to recreate this thing every single time. Alright, and then if you have other data sources that you want to connect to, you might have a data source that specify the various roles in the organization. So you might also now connect to that by adding another parallel action. For this example, we don't need to do that, and we can actually now jump into the next step. So right now we want to give the flow run the step and the option that the user selected, and to give it the rules set for these different steps and options. So in the business process profile, we're not storing the next step based on which option is stored, and that has to be done in flow. So to do this, we're going to create a new step. I think it is under, add a switch case. Switch cases are absolutely lovely things. We use it a lot. So first, let's go and give this thing some proper descriptions. So just say process, step, and option. Theoretically, the spaces shouldn't matter in the names, although I have seen in the past that they can actually mess you around. So out of habit, I try not to use spaces in names or formulas or anything like that. Alright, so first thing we want to tell it is what to look in. So we want to tell it, go and look at the from step. Sorry, this is in the wrong list. So this is the get item. Just actually rename that as well. So get data. Just makes more sense. And now we can go down to the trigger. You'll see here's the workflow history, not the workflow history, the workflow profile that we've fetched during this action over here, and this is now also available as dynamic content. So right now we're looking for the from step. So that's going to take the value of the from step, and then we're going to create different cases underneath it. So we're going to say if this is step 1, then we want to do something. If it is step 2, then we want to do something else. If it is step 3, then we want to do something else. Right, so going to step 1, we're not going to add an action. Sorry, you can cancel that. We're going to add another switch case to now evaluate what option was selected. So again, we're going to go down to the trigger dynamic content, and there's a column that we're writing from PowerApps for selected option. Alright, so then we can go and say if the selected option is submit, for an example, then you want certain things to happen. So it's important that we get these values or these option names exactly right. So at this stage I'm going to go back to my Visual Studio Code that has the JSON business process profile, and you'll see that if the type is set to JSON, then it's actually quite easy to read, and then you're just looking for the option names for the various options. So during step 1 we only have one option, so we can copy that and paste it in there. Now what's going to happen is if the user selects this option, it's going to trigger this case, and now you can add actions underneath this case. And for this option we just basically going to say we don't want to do anything strange or interesting at this stage. We just want to say we want to set a variable, and the variable that we want to set is var next step, and the next step, if the user selects submit option, is step 2. Alright, so we've now told it what to do for the options on step 1. Let's go to step 2, and we're going to add another switch case for step 2, and again tell it to look at the selected option from the trigger. Selected option, and now we can go and look at our JSON business process profile again. So we're going to step 2, and we have a request information. No, we first have an approve. So we have an approve, we have a request information, and we have a reject. Now at this stage it's important to have your workflow diagram ready to make sure that you put the right things in the right place. But essentially we can now do the same for each one of these options to go and set the variable for the next step. So we're saying that if we approve it, we'd like to go to step 4, which is recruitment. If we request information, then it should go to step 3. So at this stage we have step 4 and request information. Set variable. And we want that to go to step 3, and then under reject we want that to go to step reject. What is that? Reject. We can actually cancel this completely. So let's say we want to set that to something like the completed step. So what we can do as well is if we have a rejection option, you might want to say depending on certain settings or certain values in the data, you might want it to first go to another step and not complete it or cancel it immediately. And to do things like that where there's optional routing at play, you can use expressions to actually write that. So let's say for an example, in this case we wanted to first go and check some things in the data. We can now use expressions in order to go and have a look at these values. So I'm just going to take that value out and then go to expression, and as an example put that in here. So in this example we're connecting to the body, so we're saying if equals whatever is in the action output of the get data action, which we specified earlier. That's the get data that connects to SharePoint and fetches the data record. If that body has a temporary position value of yes, and this is the second parameter for the equals action or function, then we want it to go to step 4, otherwise to step 5 as an example. So this is typically where you do advanced routing in the business process then. The nice thing about doing it on this variable is that you only have to do it once. Over here you tell it what the next step would be, and then all of your actions through the rest of this flow run will just go and populate the values based on what the next step is. You don't need to have this formula or this function multiple times in different places. You can only have it over here. Alright, so that actually saved, but we don't need that. We can just say we want to complete that. And by specifying SZZ, we can now create a step in the business process profile in JSON called SZZ, and that'll tell the Power App what the form should look like when it is completed. What fields should be visible, what should be, well, obviously nothing should be editable, but you know, these sort of things you can then govern in that step. We now have a variable that'll tell us what the next step is based on the option was selected, and you can go and collapse that whole switch case just to clean it up a little bit, make it easier to see. Alright, so we've got that, we know what the next step is. We now want to fetch that step object from the flow business process profile so we can use that information in the rest of the flow run. So to do that, we're going to create a filter. And we're going to filter the array. What array do we want to filter? The process steps array from the fetch flow BPM profile action. And the filter criteria we want to use is we want to fetch the, what is it, step, oh sorry, this is the wrong one. We want to fetch the step ID, or we want to use the step ID and compare that to the var next step variable, and this will return our JSON object. And just rename this properly and say get destination step workflow profile. Alright, so this is now going to return the correct object or the correct step object in order for us to reuse it. And the first thing we're going to reuse it for is for the destination step name. So we know what the ID is for the destination step, but now we want to get the name. So we're going to set a variable. Actually, we're going to initialize a variable because we haven't worked with this before, and let's call that var next step name. It is a string, and this is now where we can specify the step name from the filter action. So if you select that, it should work. The only problem here is, and this is Flow being extremely clever, and Flow knows that it might get an array from the body of that action. Now the problem with that is it's usually not an issue, but in this case it is, because we want to set a variable, and you can't set a variable inside and apply to each because it's going to overwrite itself the whole time. And you'll see if you try and save this now, it's probably not going to like it, and it's going to say initialize variable cannot be nested in an action of apply to each. Alright, so to get around that, let's just remove the value, just move it out of the apply to each, delete the apply to each, and now we're going to have to rely on an expression in order to get that information. I'm sure there are other ways of doing it, but these expressions, they look intimidating, but once you get used to them, they're actually quite easy to use, and they're very easy to store somewhere in code snippets or whatever. So when you do a next process, you can just go and copy these things and use them. So it's actually not that difficult. So I'm going to connect to Visual Studio Code, and this is the expression that we're going to be using, and it says action outputs. So This is a function that knows to go and look at the outputs for all of the actions. And the action we want to point it to is the get destination step workflow profile, which is the same as that action over there. We're going to connect to the body of it, and because it could possibly be an array, just pass it a 0 to tell it fetch the first item in the array. And then once you have that first item, return the step name property. So if we copy that, put that in the expression, click OK, and then we've got our variable. Let's just name this thing appropriately. So let's go and say init var next step name. And we can now do exactly the same for other information that we're looking for in that profile. So we might want to get the next step instructions and the next step role, these sort of things. And you can do it in a similar fashion. So before we do, just make sure that saves now. We haven't saved this in a while, so there we go. Saved without an issue. And now we can continue to create more variables or initialize the rest of the variables that we need. So next, let's get the instructions from the next step. Initialize a variable. Let's just call that init var next step instructions and var next instructions. So it's going to be a string, and the value that we want, again, we need to write an expression, and we can now go back into Visual Studio Code, basically just copy that first one, go and have a look at the JSON profile. You'll see that's the step instruction, the property name that we're using for that. So we can just at this stage go and save to return that for us, and then you can easily save all of these expressions and then just reuse them in future as well, which is quite handy. So put that in there, and that should give us what we need for the step instructions. It's also going to create the role. So looking for a variable, initialize it, and we're going to call it init var next step role. It's going to be a string, and now we can go to Visual Studio Code again and copy the step instructions. Just go and have a look in the JSON profile. What do we call the role? It's responsible role. Put that in there, copy that into the expression. Just to save that, see if it's happy. It is indeed. So in this example, we've also specified an SLA duration in our business process profile. So it's SLA duration, and that's just to basically tell the users how long do they have in a specific step. You can also then do reports on it to see how people are performing against certain SLAs and these sort of things. I'm not going to go into that into too much detail, but for now, let's just go and fetch that as well in order to populate the email. This is the only thing we're going to do with it for now. Let's just go and say we want to find the variable. We're going to initialize it, so let's say init var SLA duration. var SLA duration. So I think in this case we said it is a integer, and the value of this, again, we can just copy the step role and find SLA duration and put that in there. and save that. Alright, so the next variable we're going to set, we're just going to initialize it over here because we're actually going to create another switch statement, and that is for the roles. So you can create the logic for what roles and who's responsible for which roles and so on and so forth. So let's say initialize variable init responsible person or persons, so it might be multiple people, or responsible person. So over here it will probably be a string, and we're just going to have an initial value of blank. So we're not going to be setting anything here. We're actually going to handle that through a switch statement as well. So let's just save this, make sure it's happy. And it is happy, so let's go ahead and create our switch. So we're going to create new switch case. And that's going to ask us what should it evaluate during the switch case, and we want to look at the responsible role. So we say var next responsible role, and now we're going to tell it what to do during the various, or for the various roles. So it might make it easier if you have the workflow diagram with you, or if you actually keep the list of roles handy. But essentially, I'm just going to have a look at the JSON profile now and then start profiling the roles. So we've got departmental manager, we've got human resources, so we can add that as a case. We have the departmental manager again, and then step 4 we've got the recruiter. So now that we have the 3 roles ready to be configured, we can go ahead and create the variables for each. And so just go and select set variable var responsible person. Now in its most basic form, you can go and type in a username over here, and this will set the responsible person to David whenever there is a departmental manager in the role. But in reality, you probably don't want to do that because this is actually just hard coding it, although it's still a lot better than hard coding it into buttons on the form. But essentially this is not ideal. So what you'll most likely do is, in this case, the manager is specified in the data as well. So if we go into the get data action, and you'll see that there's a manager column that is set to a person, and SharePoint then automatically gives you all of these options for that field. So you can go and say manager email as an example, and that'll then populate the responsible person to that value when it's departmental manager as a role. This is very nice from the flow guys, where if you hover over these things, it'll actually, or the dynamic content, it'll actually now show you the expression or the function in order to get to that value. So that's very, very cool. Something to note, you'll see the question marks between these attributes, and that's just to accommodate for blanks so that it doesn't crash if it is blank. Alright, so that's going to set the departmental manager to the person who's selected in that column in SharePoint. Let's move over to human resources. For human resources, you might want to connect to a SharePoint list. So you might have a list where you keep track of who's assigned to these various roles, or multiple people assigned to these various roles. Or you can have Azure AD, connect to that, get group members, you can connect to web APIs. So it's quite a long string of options that you can do in order to get to these various roles. And if in this case we connect it to a SharePoint list, in the case for human resources, you can connect to something completely different in order to determine the role. So it's quite versatile. For this example, we're just going to hard code the rest. So I set the variable, and over here we have Mike Kent, and for the recruiter we've got Tanya Pitt. So set the variable to Tanya Pitt. Alright, so this, I understand this is very messy, but you get the picture of what you could do as an example, or then different data sources as well. So we can now go ahead and collapse the switch case just to make room and make it easy to view the screen. And now we're ready to go and update the workflow history with the values that we just calculated and evaluated. So we're going to just use SharePoint, and because we're using a SharePoint list, and tell it to update an item. Again, we're just going to connect to that SharePoint site, paste that in there, choose the correct list, and this is now the history list again that we want to update with the details of the destination step. And now we can literally just go through. So title we're not using, we can actually just remove that. But okay, title we're not using. Submission date will be the same as what it was when it was created. So we'll go back to when an item was created, action or trigger, and then just select these options from that list. So process key, record ID, so here's a record ID. I actually don't think we're using process stage, doesn't matter really. From step, name. Alright, so that is still from the history list, from step name, as well as selected option and step comment. But from here on forward, the two-step, we now need to start referencing the variables that we set in order to determine what the actual next step is. So the two-step is the var next step, the two-step name is the var next step name, responsible role is var next step role, and responsible person is then var responsible person. So is processed, we want to set that to yes, and is completed, we're not going to worry about that for now, but essentially you could use that in your reporting depending on how you do your reports. You might want to mark it if a process is completed, but for now we can actually just remove that as well. I'm just going to leave that to no. So we can save this, and sorry, one thing I neglected to do, I need to tell this it should actually fail. Definition contains invalid parameters. Yes, it's because I haven't passed it the row ID for the item to update in SharePoint. So make sure that we go back to when an item is created trigger, and we pass it the ID for that row. And if we now save it, it seems to be happy. So we're now in a position to generate the email to the next responsible person, and so we're just going to add an action, send an email, nice and easy, thank you flow team, and it's going to be to the responsible person. Subject is could be Acme Workflow or your company name Workflow. Assigned to you for, we can say what the next step name is. Okay, body of the email. You can obviously do HTML and make this look a lot better, but just for demo purposes we can go and say, alright, so we can say the request has been submitted to you from the, okay, let's go in there and select from the workflow history the from step name, yes, option, no, sorry, that should be selected option. From the selected option during the from step name workflow step. Okay, and then we want to pass it the instruction, so, and that's going to be a variable, so for next step instruction. So now you can also go and extract data from the data table or the data list in SharePoint, and then construct your email from there. So what is quite important is that you include a link. I'm not going to go into that into too much detail. That's pretty much a blog on its own. But to have a link that allows the user to click on that link and take them directly into PowerApps and opening up the record that you submitted to them. So from here, in its most basic form, that should be happy. We're going to try and save this, and it's saved properly. Right, so we're now ready to open up PowerApps and actually submit this record. Alright, so we've got our Power App that we worked on earlier. If we click on the button, it's going to fetch our workflow profile, which it gets, and let's go and add a new record. Let's call this test workflow, and motivation is it is good to test, and we want to submit this. We've tested the patch earlier, so theoretically it should work. So if I now run this, we can go and have a look at our flow. Our flow has never ran, so let's see what happens. Submitted. Okay, we haven't returned it to a previous screen or have any navigation or confirmation in the button yet, so nothing else should happen on that screen. Let's have a look on flow. It's running. 6 seconds. Okay, so it says that it succeeded. Let's have a look. So it triggered. All of those things ran fine. It picked up S1 submit option. It then set the value for the next step to step 2. Okay, that's pretty cool. Now it went to fetch the profile. Let's have a look at it. Found the right profile and put that in the body. We then initiated the next step, HR approval. Yep, sounds good. Step instructions, please review this request. Yep. Next step role, human resources. SLA duration is 1. For responsible person. Okay, this is just initializing it. Almost thought it returned blank. It then through the case statement picked up human resources, assigned it to Mike Kent, updated the history item in SharePoint, and then sent an email. Okay, so it seems to have been successful. Let's open up Mike Kent's email. So here we've got Mike Kent's email, and you can see the email that was generated by the flow submission, and here's the wording that we put in. It might be a good idea to put some quotes around these values just to make it cleaner and easier to read, and then obviously HTML and links and all of the rest of it, but I think that we'll cover that in a later video or blog. But essentially our workflow has submitted successfully, and everything has gone according to plan. If we have a look at the flow run, it took 8 seconds, and typically we can now go and see where it took the longest to see if there's anything that we need to fine tune. So the SharePoint list, getting that item took 4 seconds, as well as the BPM profile also took 4 seconds. So this is a very good case for running these things in parallel. Otherwise it would have extended this flow run by 4 seconds. So other than that, I think the form ran properly. Looks pretty good. There's some tweaking that we can do, so you can go and clean up the workflow notification, put in HTML and deep linking to the actual record. We can obviously elaborate on the roles quite a bit. And then also, if you're going to reuse for this flow for multiple business processes, then essentially you'll put the process step and option switch into a higher level switch to switch between the different business processes. So in a nutshell, that concludes our session for today. Thank you very much for watching, and sorry for the lengthy video. Please join us next time, where we'll start looking at how the form now behaves according to the new step in the business process. So thank you very much for your feedback that you've been sending. Please keep them coming. We already have 1 or 2 topics that we were asked to cover in more detail, and we'll do so at the end of the video series. But thank you very much for watching, and have a good day. Bye bye.